The central element in our conference, our inaugural conference at Porat, is the panel symposium on what is our vision of modern Orthodoxy and how do we get there. As we'll say, there are significant differences between the panelists on a range of issues. We're not all speaking with one voice. There are lots of nuances between us. But I venture to suggest there are probably three major areas in which there is a general agreement, which sort of serve as the overall parameters of what Porat is and what it aspires to be. First, I think we all agree that modern Orthodoxy is ideologically compelling. We do strive for a true synthesis between Torah and modern culture. We are open to differing perspectives. We want a Jewish community in which we can discuss difficult, even contentious issues with a sense of we can learn from one another. It's long been my belief that a contentious community is not one that is a weak community. It's strengthened by the amount of passion, by the degree in which we care about these issues and how much we battle them out. Second, though, I think we're also in agreement that modern Orthodoxy in recent decades has fallen on hard times. On the one hand, a resurgence of the right, concentration of authority in Israel in the chief rabbinate, and in America in the world of the Rosh Yeshiva, has tended to mute the voices of modern Orthodoxy. And one of the real objectives of Porat is to create a counter voice that represents what modern Orthodoxy ought to be. And thirdly, that notwithstanding the setbacks that modern Orthodoxy has experienced over the last 5 decades, what we're witnessing today in the 21st century, and in many ways the backdrop of this kind of conference, is a resurgence of modern Orthodox institutions, programs, modern Orthodox thinking, not all of which is going to be completely consensual. There'll be significant differences between them. But in many ways, both here and in Israel, more is happening in the way of a modern Orthodox resurgence than many of us would have dreamt about even a short decade or two ago. So with that as a framework, I'd like to turn to the first question I'd like to pose to the panelists. For about half an hour or so, the panelists will engage in discussion on some pre-prepared questions that have been shared with them. Then we'll open up to the audience, to audience participation. Some questions have already been submitted online, and we'll have an overall general debate on the future of modern Orthodoxy. So let me turn to the first question. If you could choose one attribute of contemporary modern Orthodoxy to amplify, what would that attribute be? And conversely, if there was one aspect of contemporary Orthodoxy you would like to change, what would be the change and why? Blu, you're right to my right, so perhaps I could just begin with you.
So I just begin by saying what I like best about modern Orthodoxy is its very special way of life as defined by mitzvot and halacha, and the fact that that way of life is not simply a symbol of religious commitment or spiritual expression, but it's something that defines you as a person, defines you as a human being in 1,000 large and small ways. In other words, there's a human message, sort of a human tagline to all of the observances. And we know that food, sex, leisure and work, memory, relationships, a feeling, understanding of the other, and much more, these are all important aspects of life that add up to the whole person. And what is true is that halacha has something to say about every one of these areas of life. I learned this from my husband, who learned it from his teacher, Rav Soloveitchik, who didn't atomize halacha, but enlarged its canopy of meaning. I also appreciate about modern Orthodoxy its record on Israel. Modern Orthodoxy is the indispensable Zionist group that helped build the state in coalition with secular Jews, and without which our people wouldn't have survived. And modern Orthodox have been the most steadfast group in defending Israel. Doesn't mean you can't sometimes criticize, but certainly defending Israel in these hard times, celebrating the existence of Israel, making aliyah in disproportionate numbers, sending gap year students, etc. And I think only Birthright comes up second behind modern Orthodoxy, while I think the liberal denominations are much more split in their commitment and their criticisms of Israel. But that's actually not the question at hand, and so I want to, but I want to say that's the definition I'm bringing into the conversation. What I appreciate most about modern Orthodoxy is about being able to bring this way of life with me as I engage the world, as I walk through life. I'm describing this what Stephen and Victoria presented in philosophical terms. I'm presenting as an experience, internal experience. No matter where I am or who I'm speaking with or engaging in conversation or encounter, I have this portable faith with me at all the times. I'm part of the world, but I'm also outside of it. I'm always marching to the beat of a different drummer. I'm holding my own. I'm aware that I have something very special in me, something distinctive that I carry, and what I carry are my people's standards and values. And this gives me a tremendous sense of exhilaration. I can't even articulate what it is. Exhilaration and freedom, even though I know that some people see me, some others see me as bound hand and foot to a set of rules and regulations. And even though I might occasionally chafe under restraints or restrictions, I always know that I have this tremendous inheritance and take it with me. In two other ways, modern Orthodoxy is very precious to me, and that is that it's enabled its adherence, that's us, to bringing our everyday lives to contribute and shape the society around us, all of you, as you are living in the culture. And also, it helps Jews, 90% of our community, who have already integrated, at 100% into the society, well integrated into society. It serves as a model to help them to live Jewishly and not assimilate. So that I can be a citizen of the world and also partake of its great gifts, its culture, human values, human rights records, and art and music and politics, although maybe not this year, medicine, and all the while remaining faithful to an ancient tradition, balancing freedom and restraint. That's one of the geniuses of modern Orthodoxy. And I would say the most powerful example in my lifetime is the integration of feminist values of equality, women's learning, ritual expression, life cycle celebration, leadership roles, creation of liturgical communities. All this is nothing short of amazing. And even though sometimes I'm inside that box that is complaining, if I look at the larger picture, to think that all of this has happened within the last 50 years, which is the blink of an eye as Jews count time, is nothing short of amazing. And who would have ever imagined, who would have ever thought that all of these changes would be wrought in our lifetimes without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, without watering down commitment to halakha and mitzvot? It's quite awesome, literally quite awesome. So that's what I want to see amplified. The second part of the question, since I've exceeded my 3 minutes, I'll answer in the next round if I may be permitted to come back to it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Blu. Roy Steinmetz.
Okay, when the question was posed, what do you think the strengths and weaknesses of modern Orthodoxy, what are they? When we spoke on the phone, I said, well, first perhaps we should just discuss what modern Orthodoxy is, which actually Blu did quite capably. But I want to explain why I wanted to go in that direction. Because a few weeks ago, I was asked to speak to some of the seniors at Ramaz. And I was asked to present about what modern Orthodoxy is. And I went around the room and I said, well, what do you think modern Orthodoxy is? And essentially, each of the students, and these were very good students, these were not the marginal students, these were the best students. And their answers were essentially a variation of dati light, the Israeli phenomenon of dati light. Well, it's being Orthodox, but not being so extreme, or being more laid back about it. And I was incredibly disappointed, and I felt that, before we talk about what the strengths and weaknesses of modern Orthodoxy are, we really need to go back to first principles. And I think that if you look at the various streams of modern Orthodoxy in the modern era, they really come in three different ways. There's an intellectual stream, which in many ways is based on the Rambam, who believes that you can be inspired to become closer to God by studying secular studies, by studying about science and philosophy, and that there is this intellectual modern orthodoxy that believes that by reading more broadly, you become a better Jew and a better servant of God. So this is one stream, the intellectual stream of modern orthodoxy. But then there's another stream, which is social modern orthodoxy. Blu made reference to being a citizen of the world. There is a very strong element within modern orthodoxy which wants to allow people to live a dignified, ordinary type of life and still adhere to Orthodox principles. So that means that when you come to synagogue, you'll hear a sermon in the vernacular, and that hopefully, although not always, synagogue services will be decorous, and that they will have a proper decorum. But the sense that you can come in and be a citizen of the world and act in a similar way when you go to synagogue or when you're participating within your community. And in fact, KJ would probably be a perfect example of that type of institution, to allow people to feel fully American, fully modern, and yet at the same time fully Orthodox. So there's a social stream. And then there's a third stream, which is really an outcome of modernity, which is as the Jewish people fragment, or as the opportunity to go back to Israel arises, how do we relate to this? And I think this third element is a very, very critical element, in that there are those who looked at the world and said we need to still hold on to the concept of Klal Yisrael, that no matter what, we need to be a family and we need to be a nation. And by the way, that's one of the areas that modern Orthodoxy should be the most proud of, that if we do our job properly, and I say this all the time, we are the only people who will know someone in the Satmar community and someone in the Reform and Reconstructionist and secular community. And that's something we should be very proud of. So these are the three streams. These are the three elements within modern Orthodoxy. So what becomes the strengths and the weaknesses? Well, when you talk about intellectual modern Orthodoxy, which, by the way, is what has a deep resonance for me, it's what drew me from a Haredi background into modern Orthodoxy. The problem with that is that the ability to read widely and be inspired by it is really an elite activity. It's not an activity that would necessarily be embraced by the Hamon, that would be embraced by the multitude. And that we have to have a recognition that the rarefied intellectual modern Orthodoxy, where you go and you talk about Kant or you talk about Aristotle, and then you try to relate it to a concept that you found in the Rambam or in the Parsha, that's not a simple thing to do, and it's not something that necessarily will relate to everyone. And so we have to understand that that's true. The other thing is that in terms of social modern Orthodoxy, when you try to make our religious service something that allows people to feel more comfortable, at the same time, it may be perceived as inauthentic. We know this as rabbis, that if your beard isn't long enough, you're not really a rabbi. And you could be standing next to someone who hasn't learned the day in yeshiva, but if his beard is longer, they will address him as rabbi. And you'll be the other guy. We know this. So there's the perception of inauthenticity, but there's more than that. When we bring things down and we cool them down to make them, so to speak, acceptable, there is a loss of a certain intensity that actually draws people to religion and to Judaism in the first place. So very often our strengths end up becoming some of our weaknesses, which is the truth of almost anything in life. And as we set forward to make progress as a group of modern Orthodox Jews who want to do our best for Klal Yisrael, we need to understand what our strengths are, and our strengths are manifold. Because I have to tell you that if someone has questions, someone who's intellectual, this is their only place. It's very difficult to ask questions elsewhere. But at the same time, we need to know what our weaknesses are if we're really going to be able to win the hearts and minds of others and bring them closer to the avodas Hashem that we see correct.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. Ann?
Okay. I want to preface my remarks. Can you hear me? Okay. That the perspective that I offer is for the world outside of New York. I'm speaking first as a layperson and second sort of as an out-of-towner. For me, the greatest strength of modern Orthodoxy, out-of-towners get a little applause? Okay. For me, the greatest strength of modern Orthodoxy is that as a movement, it has the potential to be the great unifier of the Jewish people across North America. At the present moment, though, I would venture to say that the majority of the Jewish community in North America does not know that there is a difference between modern Orthodox or any other iteration of Orthodoxy, centrist Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Lubavitch, etc. I can say that as someone who did not grow up Orthodox, and I can say that as someone who has, since becoming Orthodox, has traveled across North America, visiting dozens of Jewish communities as National Chair of Women's Philanthropy for Jewish Federations of North America. So how did I get here? I was working as a Jewish Federation professional when I met my husband, Jeremy, an Orthodox Jew, 27 years ago. I, like the Jews in the most recent Pew study, I felt very proud to be Jewish, but I was totally disconnected from religion. And Tikkun Olam was my religion. I was passionate about feeding the poor and housing the homeless and equal rights for women and all minorities. And until I met Jeremy, I had no idea that all those lofty ideals came directly from Judaism. I actually thought they were born out of Christianity. Being introduced to Orthodox Judaism was incredibly transformational for me. My only hesitation as a feminist and as a woman who had already held many leadership roles was thinking about where would I fit in a community that was willing to exclude women from leadership positions. Would I have a voice? Would I have a role? Was it possible to raise a daughter to grow up feeling proud and smart in a community that would say no to her in religious areas of her life? And then, lucky for me, I met my friend Blu. And she introduced me to Jofa. And I learned that although it might be a struggle, in modern Orthodoxy, many of these obstacles were cultural and not halachic. The concerns did not need to be a barrier to me to benefit and participate in the beauty of an Orthodox lifestyle. And I thought if others knew this, perhaps they too would find a place for themselves in the Orthodox community. So here is what I'd like to change, and this may be where I'm influenced by being an out-of-towner. Living in West Hartford, Connecticut, and having traveled to many Jewish communities across the country has provided me with the opportunity to recognize that we in the modern Orthodox community are a tiny percent of the Jewish population, and that we need to be less insular and proudly get our message out to the broader Jewish community. There are so many people out there volunteering for the Jewish world who are craving for Jewish connection and meaning. Modern Orthodoxy has the ability to provide the content and inspiration to strengthen their spiritual and religious lives. It is an opportunity for us to become role models. This is why, even though I've always worked very hard, tirelessly for my local Orthodox community, I agreed to a national position with JFNA. We have a treasure in modern Orthodoxy, and I believe we have a responsibility to bring it to the greater community. Last week, my friend Erica Brown published an article called Exclusion on the Menu in the Jewish Week. She writes about how it feels to be at a Jewish event, having a wonderful time with everyone at your table, and then your enormous triple-wrapped kosher meal comes. And you feel awkward just trying to figure out how to open the darn thing, and all the other guests are uncomfortable. The pleasant bantering stops, and suddenly there is a them and us divisive feeling at the table. She ends her paragraph with the sentence, quote, "You wonder why traditional Jews don't support your organization. They're probably not feeling your love." Having been in this situation often, I really don't believe that last statement. And in fact, when it happens to me, The people at my table are terribly embarrassed that their guest speaker can't eat the meal. They feel awful that they didn't know I was Orthodox. I feel like that's sort of like you don't look Jewish. But I use it as an opportunity to have a conversation about having kosher food at a Jewish event. There is no malice when a Jewish event is not kosher. People in the general Jewish community are simply not thinking kosher because there is no one engaging with them with whom kashrut matters. It's not on their radar because they don't know us. I truly believe that we as a modern Orthodox movement steeped in Torah and tradition, combined with the openness and inclusivity, especially in the area of women, could be a unifying bridge for North American Jewry. We would cease to be the other, and we might just be the key that inspires people to embrace Judaism in a more rich and meaningful fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Rav Benny, perhaps you can give us a view from Israel as well?
And when I'm talking about modern Orthodox in Israel, I think that the message that we can make always better is ask questions. We can say a lot of things about answers, different answers, but without questions, nothing will happen. Without people who push the rabbis, the leaders, strongly, all aspects, all time, nothing will happen in the area, not in the Rabbanut, not in the halachic world, not in Batei Knesset, not anywhere. And the only way by build society who have the koach, the power to ask questions, is to teach them that they have the ability, that they read books by their own, not by art scrolls, but they read the books and they can deal with the books, argue with the books, and then the question will raise in the world. No answer will come without that. I can say specifically about myself, after 25 years in the rabbinate world in Israel, I know that I never did one step before someone pushed me strongly. I didn't change the brachot, okay, Birkot HaShachar, about Shelo Asani, Shelo Asani, Shelo Asani, okay, because I had the privilege to be a rabbi in kibbutz 25 years ago. And one of the members was Dr. Gili Zivan, a teacher from the kibbutz, and she starts pushing me strongly that it's against the moral that we'll say that brachot. And we learn together, and today, me, my family, whole kibbutz, whole community, say the brachot differently, in a positive way. And Blu know how many steps we do because people who try to ask questions. It's true about conversion, it's true about modernity, it's true about all aspects of life. To be modern Orthodox is to ask questions, to stand strongly, and to say to the leader, to the rabbis all over, to say you have different options. It's true about disabilities. It's true about what subject that you want to use. We know that when you have the knowledge, you can have the koach to ask your question, and then someone need to make the answer. Now, when we are going to that, what we call the chachamim, the sages, the rabbanut, all the people who had the keys in their hands, this is a very serious subject, because in Israel we know Rabbanut Rashit have their own position. More and more go to the Haredi world, but if we mean the people, the modern Orthodox people, feel strong enough by the hashkafa, we know that the Torah, we learned enough, we know the abilities, we know that there are answers inside the halachic world, then we can fight. And we can fight strongly, and in the end, the people listen. If I'm trying to see the map in Israel, I know nothing about states, not in New York, not out of New York, but when I'm talking about Israel, I can tell you openly, the modern Orthodox deeply strong in Israel, in the Kehilot, in the population. Because the rabbis can say whatever they want, but nikarim divrei emet. If you say things from the Torah, from Avodat Hashem, with knowledge, with the sources, and you bring your Torah with your all belief, people will listen. And people do many, many steps because that all around, not just in small places like Katamon or other places, all over Israel, we can see the effect of the modern Orthodox, and the map is much, much different when you start and say that we are in the corner. Baruch Hashem, it's completely different.
Rav Benny's comments actually inspire a sort of a subsidiary question, direct follow-up to that. He's drawn attention between a grassroots that wants to see significant change. He's encouraging them to apply pressure on the rabbinate, and in turn, the rabbinate will adapt or react to it. My question would be as follows. The hallmark of modern culture is very much one of personal conscience, freedom of thought, individual autonomy. The hallmark of orthodoxy, of any stripe, if you will, rests upon halachic authority. Now, in recent years, we've seen even more centralization of that halachic authority in Israel, in the chief rabbinate, and in America here in the Rosh Yeshiva. My question, though, would be, how do you define a truly modern orthodoxy that can respond, on the one hand, to the legitimate demands for freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of the individual, and a traditionalism that's based upon authority being lodged in the rabbinate?
Look, it's an interesting question. The idea of rabbinic authority is one that really doesn't have any formal meaning in contemporary times. There is no longer a Sanhedrin. The idea that you're bound to listen to a rabbi or a group of rabbis simply isn't true, because there's always another rabbi around the corner. No, I mean that's the truth. I'm not making look. It's funny because in the ultra Orthodox world, and there's the concept of Das Torah, and I remember in my time in yeshiva, and I won't say who it was, but discussing with one of the prominent Rosh Yeshiva of the Haredi world, where we had a conversation about what does it mean when you talk about Das Torah, and he looked at me and he said, it's no different than when you decide that there's an expert doctor and that his opinion counts for more perhaps than another doctor, that maybe he has a greater expertise or greater insight so that he can answer medical questions in a more profound and correct fashion. So he says, maybe that's what Das Torah is. But in other words, he admitted to me that there really is no such source. And the truth is that, look, I mean, Binyamin Brown, others have done the history of the concept of Das Torah. But the idea that there is a central authority, I don't even think within the Haredi world it's necessarily accepted. And Yoel Finkelman has written on ambivalence about, talking about who's jockeying for position on the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah. But leaving that sort of academic thing aside, the truth is that there isn't rabbinic authority. It really does begin from the grassroots. And there are multiple examples of this within the community where, for whatever reason, the community chose not to follow the official authority. I mean, I love the example of the Minchas Elazar, that his son-in-law, Rabbi Baruch Rabinovich, became a Zionist. The Minchas Elazar was the Munkacher Rebbe, who was the #1 anti-Zionist in Europe. And his son-in-law, after the war, decided to become a Zionist, and the Hasidim left him and appointed actually his own son as the Rebbe eventually. The idea is that the authority, even though it looks like it's invested in a particular rabbinic figure or a group of rabbinic figures, very often it's really the community. Now, sometimes the community decides that it picks a certain rabbi because they like his ideology. Sometimes they decide that they're picking a certain rabbi because he's charismatic. And sometimes it's because they really believe that this is a unique person in terms of the way they serve God and their insight into Torah. So we have to recognize that very often it's really the grassroots. And this comes to what Rabbi Lau already said. Ultimately, the grassroots are going to determine the direction of who the Gedolim are. Now, on the one side, again, we have to look at ourselves critically, and I'm harping on that point because that's what I think is one of the great strengths of modern Orthodoxy, is that we're capable of looking at ourselves critically because we understand that that's really what we want to do. We want to make ourselves better. We do have to look at ourselves critically and say, why are there not more people who see things the way we do? What are we not articulating properly? What are we not expressing properly? But on the other side, I think there's room for a great deal of optimism. I really think that underneath the surface, there are a lot of people who look to us, even if they don't necessarily act like us. They look to us for leadership. They look to us for our ideas. And the line I always tell my friends in the yeshiva world is that if modern Orthodoxy didn't exist, you would have to invent it, because there needs to be this place, even from your perspective, there needs to be modern Orthodoxy. This ideology has to be here. Now it's up to us to decide how to really express it in a fashion that makes it much more interesting and much more passionate.
Blu, you've had probably the most direct personal experience here. You fought for at least 30, 35 years against the establishment authority, and you built an entire movement on that basis.
So I agree with some of what Rabbi Steinmetz said. Firstly, thank you for those lovely compliments, but it was a whole community that did this in the last 40 years. But to some extent, we've succeeded. But I think in the ways that Rabbi Steinmetz has described, I don't think we're there yet. In fact, right now, Porat is a symbol that we are moving in that direction. We're taking a turn. But I do think that one of the problems or one of the shortcomings of modern Orthodoxy, of modern Orthodox leadership, is that it, in its current state, has largely abdicated responsibility to the Gedolim. And since it is the modern Orthodox, since it is the rabbinic leadership that influences students, community, institutions, etc., many of our communities, including our communities outside of New York and around the country, have now assumed that the Gedolim are the decisors for the questions that they have, and that on the issue of conversion, in some areas of women's rights, on pluralism, the relationship to liberal Jews and to non-Jews, general respect for people who hold other ideologies. I'm not talking about interpersonal friendships with people on different positions, but of movements, attitudes towards higher education, which is, thankfully, modern Orthodoxy still holds the sway there, but even in the area of the influence of I would say an anti-Zionist stream in the world of the Gedolim, I think those have taken their toll on modern Orthodox communities around the country. So I do believe also that it is very much so that it's community, but I will say that the issue that I have been involved with in the last several years, the issue of the Agunah, points to a very different reality right now, and certainly necessary to change that. Sometimes I look at this, it's 70 years since, since the divorce rate began to rise, and the increase in the problem of recalcitrance, of seruv get, where a husband can withhold the get, and the threat of get abuse. It's 70 years since that, 60 years since the rabbinate first acknowledged that a problem existed. It's 50 years since the creation of Agunah activist groups. It's 40 years since civil get laws were passed. It's 30 years since the first prenuptial agreement was created. It's 20 years since the Rachman Beit Din tried to end Igun and was quashed by his modern Orthodox colleagues. And it's a dozen or more years since the books and films and oral rallies and conferences and research and new and improved prenups have either tried to highlight or solve the problem. And yet here we are today, all these years later, with Agunah coming up through the pipeline, fresh Agunah on a regular basis, and no systemic solution in the sight of the community leaders. And the one Beit Din, which is the international Beit Din that expressly stated its agenda to end the abuse of these Agunot, has to be, and has been totally transparent in its work, has to fend off the opposition on a daily basis. And the rabbinic leadership that even bothers to look at what this particular Beit Din is doing is still asserting the Chumrah paradigm, and that no systemic solution, halakha cannot reinterpret, anything but in the strictest mode. I can't tell you how many times I've heard in the last 4 years this statement. And those of you who are familiar with the Talmudic statement, the converse statement will be surprised that how Dayanim say, when it comes to the Agunah issue, we, meaning we, the rabbis, have to be machmir. And it just totally goes against the grain of everything that Orthodoxy should stand for, which is justice and the new lessons of equality. So I have learned on this particular issue that we're not anywhere near home base yet, and that even when pressured to acknowledge that the Agunah by recalcitrance represents an injustice, there's still no will to challenge that principle of absolute right, still no desire to say that it violates our mega principles of justice and human rights, still no desire to acknowledge that it hurts us in the eyes of as an ethical religion in the eyes of the world, and that politics and control play a great measure in what's happening. And most Orthodox rabbis, I'm sorry to say, not you, Rabbi Steinmetz, not Rabbi Lau, but I think more of your colleagues are concerned about what the Gedolim think about this issue than how it affects a woman's lives. And I want to comment that Rabbi Simcha Kraus, who's the Beit Din of the International Beit Din, is a giant. And I could tell you personally that he literally spends his days and nights in the sea of halakha trying to find legitimate, lenient halachic precedents, and what he gets on the other side is this continuous search for, chumrot. So I think you're right in saying that it is the community because it's not going to come from the leadership, it's not going to come from, the rabbinic institutions, and it is going to come from the community. And I think that's why Porat is so essential. Porat, Jofa, lay organizations, where there can be an organized voice to, reinstitute or reinstall some of the meta-halachic principles into Orthodoxy. And the community has a big job, and if it doesn't do its work, we'll have Agunot for another 75 years, or I should say 70 years from the day that prenuptials become mandatory and are universally applied, and even that is a long way off. Every one of us sitting here and all the relationships that we have out there we can build on are so important so that we don't lose the chain of authority. And here is where I think I heard a different tone in Rabbi Lau's description of leadership, and that is that I think I personally want to affirm this chain of tradition. I personally feel that the authority of rabbis is very important to the continuity of the community. Otherwise, everyone's going to do what they want. I see what happens with young couples in the Orthodox community who say, you know, nothing's ever going to happen. We're just going to go get married in a civil marriage or some other thing. I don't think that's a good solution. So I hope that we will, you know, not try to sidestep, but rather, as a community, work with the pressure, you know, to convince the leaders that this is the direction they must take.
Thank you, Blu. We have a number of questions that have come in about modern Orthodox day schools, which certainly in the States is regarded as the jewel of the system. One specific question: how can educational institutions, modern Orthodox day schools, address the challenge of multiple expressions of modern Orthodoxy, on the one hand, while maintaining a sense of community among the parent body? In other words, if we're about acceptance of diversity, to what extent can we do that and at the same time strengthen a sense of community within the parent body?
I'd like to make two comments about day schools, one that is not in this question. When I was writing my previous remarks about the wanting the modern Orthodox community to be more present sort of in the general Jewish community, I honestly believe that part of the reason that we're not always there is because we're so swamped in our day schools that we can't get out and be in the rest of the world. They're extremely expensive, and we're trying to keep them full. And I think one of the things that if we were sort of out in the greater community more often, we might be able to deal with the day school expense problem with support from the larger community. And that's just an aside. But I also, in a smaller community, as Rabbi Steinmetz was just saying, you have no choice but to become more diverse in your modern Orthodox schools, or else your modern Orthodox schools are going to close. There just aren't enough Orthodox kids to fill Orthodox schools, and we know that they need to be Orthodox for the Orthodox families to keep coming. And so we do find that is a real struggle. But I think one of the things that we often try to encourage parents to think about, we tend to be a people who think that, if our children are going to be with kids less religious than they are, then they're going to become less religious. When in fact, I think if you really take a look in the schools where kids who are not Orthodox and are attending our Orthodox schools, they tend to rise to the occasion, and our children are leading the way. And so I actually think it's the opposite. I think that rather than thinking everybody's going to sink to a lower level, that in fact all ships rise when we allow everyone to be part of our community and embrace them and welcome them.
Okay. Several questions are actually almost a direct segue to Ann's last comments and a real direct challenge to Porat and its leadership. They relate to the question of homosexuality. There have been a number of such questions. I'd like to take two, which I think are indicative. First one is, the mission statement of Porat refers to inclusion of lesbian and gay individuals as a value. However, the very language lesbian and gay indicates a disconnect with the needs of the LGBTQ community as it excludes BTQ. How can the Orthodox community work towards the inclusivity of the LGBTQ community? Second one is even more pointed. Seriously, how will I be included as an LGBTQ Orthodox Jew within Porat?
Just this afternoon, I got an email on it from a young couple in Montreal that I know very well. And they felt very disturbed. They're having a traditional ceremony. They're having a conservative rabbi officiate. And I have to tell you, I'm heartbroken because I don't have a better answer for them either. I'm limited. I'm limited in what I can say. I'm limited in what I can do for them. And what I do is I speak to them and I tell them that I absolutely love them And I know that that's not enough of an answer either. And I think that the most important thing that we need to do is at least appreciate the question, appreciate the pain behind the question, feel the pain behind the question. Orthodoxy is fundamentally fundamentalist. But if we can't feel the pain, if we can't understand what people are feeling, then we'll never be able to untie this knot. And I sit here and I offer you an answer that's not an answer. But I share it with you because I think that many of you may be in the same place, or many of you may not be willing to hear the pain. But we really have to hear that pain. And we really have to be able to relate to it, and we can't just push it aside, because there are a lot of people who are in a lot of pain on this issue.
I think that the gay revolution is actually more profound in the sense of, turning the earth, turning all of our notions upside down than the feminist revolution. And in that sense, it's been much more difficult to come up, with satisfactory answers, and with simply, that listening is the primary response. Listening with compassion is the primary response. And that I think that we have to see ourselves as a community in process on this issue. It's not going to be, given that how fundamental this change is, it's not going to be, in a year or two that we're going to resolve this. So in a sense, it's going to require some patience, and this perhaps will not be heard as fair, but some patience on the part of LGBT, I was getting Q community, but hopefully they will see it as, a process moving towards a resolution of, their sense of being outsiders in the community. So I just simply say we don't have to have, I don't know whether we have to have a manifesto as part of the Porat. I think some statement that says that we're in process in dealing with this issue and we are listening, is going to be, may have to be the way for the next, short term.
So I feel like I don't really represent anybody but a human, I don't know, I'm not speaking on behalf of Porat, and I'm not sure Porat's actually speaking in a unified voice yet. But you said something earlier, Rabbi, about how the grassroots will determine the Gedolim and the grassroots. And I think that we, who are the lay people in the community, are recognizing that I think it's going to come from the grassroots. The LGBTQ community is here. They want to be, if they're Orthodox, they want to be a part of us. They want to be recognized. The rest of the Jewish world is reaching out, and I think we have to do the same. And I think that it's not just about listening. I think it's going to, I hope, and I'm happy to be part of it. I hope that it will be part of our grassroots efforts of being inclusive and loving and welcoming.
Okay, I'd like to ask a somewhat different question, really unrelated. Again, it came from the audience, and it covers one of the points that was only alluded to here. The question reads as follows: do you think the gap year is hurting modern Orthodoxy? And if so, how would you change it? Now, this is a question that really is on the minds of a great many parents whose children complete 12 years of day school education, and a new norm has been created of a year of study in Israel. On the surface, that's been embraced by the modern Orthodox world. If anything, it's almost a kind of modern Orthodox norm that's become universal. Yet many of us have discovered that attending Israeli institutions, being exposed to faculty that are totally unsympathetic to modern Orthodoxy, the young people come back values at odds with those of their parents. Rav Soloveitchik did say in the late 1970s, and it's been quoted by in several sources, that he had his doubts as to whether it was worthwhile to take young people from very fine modern Orthodox homes, give them an Israeli education, an Israeli yeshiva, even for 1 year, and then discover that they're very distant from the modern Orthodoxy of their parents' homes. We've tended to ignore this because we think it's an unadulterated, great boon, great virtue that we're sending all of our young people to Israel. And I think Blu mentioned this in her comments. But the question was raised, is this an unmitigated blessing, or are there things that need to be changed about it?
So, I don't think you can calibrate it perfectly. Once you send your children out into the world to encounter different ideas, you can expect that it's not going to flow exactly in the same model with which they left or which they grew up. I remember Gary Rosenblatt's article a number of years ago. It was called Flipping Out. What was happening when young people, I don't think he was writing about his own children, but were going to Israel and coming back flipped out, or frummed out was the other expression of it. But on the one hand, I think there's something to be proud of, and that the intensification of learning and of religious expression and intensity and spirit, and that it's going to find a rebalancing in some, and it's going to find a further development in others. And I don't think it's anything that we have. I mean, I can't speak personally because that didn't happen with my children. When they went, they came back in pretty much the same mold with which they left. And I don't know how I would have tolerated if a child came back and said, your kashrut isn't kosher enough for me. That probably would have been quite painful for me. But that's when you set your children free in whichever direction you set them, you have to expect it's not going to be a perfect line, and I think there's something to celebrate in many instances.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank the panelists. They certainly have raised a ton of issues. Before concluding, I've taken careful notes of the discussion. I did draw at least 3 reasons why we need Porat based on the discussion we've had here this evening. And it comes from different sides of the panel, different expressions that have been raised at one point or another. Ann spoke in terms of the bridge building element. That really is modern Orthodoxy's significance to the entire Jewish community. Namely that on the one hand, the voice of Orthodoxy has so much to offer in Jewish communal discourse. But as long as that voice is going to be an isolated voice, not in constant sync and not in constant contact with the broader Jewish community, it's going to be a voice that will go unheard. A truly modern Orthodoxy can service the entire Jewish community, but precisely by permitting the voices of Orthodoxy to be heard. So in that sense, that bridge-building function is forfeited once modern Orthodoxy loses its sense of independence, loses its sense of self-confidence, loses its willingness to serve as a kind of ambassador of tradition, if you will, to the broader Jewish community. So that reason alone, I think Porat has an enormous contribution to make. Second, and this has been addressed initially by Rabbi Lau and I think by all the other panelists as well, and that is that as long as modern Orthodoxy is the preserve of a few intellectuals who like to talk about Kant and Hegel and their relationship to Judaism, it's essentially much more of an intellectual exercise than an attempt at Jewish renewal, an attempt of what we call Porat, People for Orthodox Renaissance and Tradition. For it to become a movement, it needs to be grassroots. That's where the pressure will come from. As long as there's no pressure, then the most extreme voices will prevail because no one is pressuring them to think in terms of what is your responsibility to the community at large. One very specific example of this, which I think Rabbi Lau was focused on precisely, was the entire issue of conversion. If you view conversion strictly from the top of the eyes of the Rosh Yeshiva, the answer is very simple. Become fully observant, and then we'll think about converting you. If you look at the real problems in the communities, among real people living there, people who want to be committed Jews, find that their children are involved in serious relationships with people who might consider conversion, the exclusionary approach to conversion is simply irrelevant. But you need grassroots pressure to move towards more inclusive positions on conversion. And third, I think the issue of homosexuality, again, broadly defined, and including some of the specifics that were raised here, is a very good barometer of why we need Porat. That there are a ton of questions like that to which there simply are no easy answers. And if the answer is simply no, or the answer is simply yes, it's a meaningless answer. What Porat can do is to open up the atmospherics, open up the ethos and climate within the Jewish community, that we can have serious exchange and discussion on these issues. Now, frankly, again, as long as the discussion is administered from on high, it tends to be a rather closed discussion. By opening up the discussion, Rabbi Steinmetz says, hear the pain. What I think he's really saying is that what we need is a place where we need to work out these problems in the full realization that solutions are not going to be easy, but the dialogue itself is the hallmark of modern orthodoxy, in direct contrast to the position of ask the Rosh Yeshiva, they'll tell you what it is, and then move on to the next question. I think those are three reasons by themselves validate what we're trying to do here with Porat. Again, I want to thank all the panelists for giving us that kind of framework.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.